Let me be honest with you for a second. You are probably watching this video right now because something at work has been eating at you. Maybe it is that one person who rolls their eyes every time you speak. Maybe it is the passive-aggressive emails that say one thing but mean something completely different. Maybe it is the tension in the room so thick you can actually feel it the moment you walk through the door, and you are exhausted. Not just physically tired, deeply, soul-draining exhausted from having to navigate it every single day. I know that feeling. And I want you to know something. You are not weak for struggling with this. You are not the problem for feeling this way. What you are dealing with is one of the most psychologically taxing things a human being can experience, because toxic team tension does not stay at work. It follows you home. It sits next to you at dinner, it wakes you up at 3 in the morning replaying conversations in your head, thinking about what you should have said differently. And here is what makes it even worse. Nobody talks about it openly. You cannot just walk into your boss's office and say the team is falling apart. You cannot call out the tension without looking like the difficult one. So you do what most people do. You smile through it, you stay quiet, you try to keep the peace. And every single day, a little piece of your confidence quietly chips away. But here is what I want you to understand before we go any further. The reason you have not been able to fix this yet is not because you lack skill or courage. It is because nobody ever taught you a practical, non-confrontational framework for resolving this kind of tension. And that is exactly what we are going to work through today. Now, before I dive deeper, I do want to mention that we have a program linked in the video description below. If after watching this video you feel like you need more structured guidance, more depth, and a real step-by-step system to transform the way you handle team dynamics, that link will be there. But most people who see this video wait too long and then wonder why nothing changed. So keep that in mind. Now let me paint you a picture. Imagine you are sitting in a team meeting. The atmosphere is off. You can feel it. Someone makes a suggestion and someone else immediately shuts it down with a tone that is just a little too sharp. Nobody says anything. Everybody looks down at their phones or their laptops. And in that silence, something invisible is communicated. Nobody here feels safe. Nobody here trusts each other. And the real tragedy is that this team probably used to work well together. Something shifted, something broke. And now everyone is just performing cooperation while silently resenting each other. Studies on workplace psychology show that teams operating under chronic interpersonal tension are up to 50% less productive than psychologically safe teams. That is not a small number. That is half of your team's potential just evaporating into the air because of unresolved conflict. And companies lose billions of dollars every year to this exact problem. But let us make it personal, because this is not just about company statistics. Think about what this is costing you specifically. How many times this week have you avoided a conversation because you did not want to make things worse? How many decisions have you second-guessed because you are not sure how someone would react? How many hours have you spent mentally rehearsing conversations that you never actually had? That is your time. That is your mental energy. That is your life being spent on managing tension instead of building something meaningful. Here's the first shift that changes everything. Stop trying to resolve the conflict. Start trying to understand the signal. Every act of passive aggression, every eye roll, every clipped response in an email, every awkward silence, those are not personality flaws. They are signals. They are someone communicating something they do not feel safe saying directly. When you start approaching tension as a signal instead of an attack, your entire physiological response to it changes. Your nervous system stops treating it as a threat. And when you are not in fight or flight mode, you can actually think clearly enough to do something useful. This is something the most respected leaders and communication experts in the world have been teaching for decades. The ability to regulate your own emotional response before engaging with someone else's dysfunction is the single greatest differentiator between people who create psychologically safe teams and people who inadvertently make tension worse. And here is the uncomfortable truth. Most people make it worse. Not because they are bad people. Because they react instead of respond. Because they take it personally. Because they have never been shown a different way. Let me show you a different way. There is a technique I want you to think about called curiosity-first engagement. Instead of addressing what someone did or said, you open with a genuine question about how they are experiencing the situation. Not a manipulative question. A real one. Something like, I noticed things felt a little strained in the meeting earlier and I just wanted to check in. Is everything okay on your end? That question does something extraordinary. It completely disarms the defensive posture. Because the person on the other end of that tension is expecting to be confronted. They are braced for it. And when instead they receive genuine curiosity and concern, something shifts, not always immediately. But the dynamic begins to crack open. And once there is even a tiny opening, connection becomes possible. Now I want you to think about the alternative. The version of events where you never say anything, where the tension just keeps building quietly under the surface. Research on unresolved workplace conflict shows that ignored tension tends to escalate by an average of 60% over 3 months. What starts as a few awkward interactions becomes full-blown factions. Us versus them. Political maneuvering. Good people quietly updating their resumes and walking out the door. The cost of doing nothing is always higher than it feels in the moment. But here is where this gets really interesting, and where most leadership advice completely misses the mark. Resolving toxic team tension is not about having one big conversation. It is about creating a series of small, low-stakes moments that rebuild psychological safety brick by brick. Think of it like this. Trust was not destroyed in a single dramatic moment. It eroded slowly over dozens of small moments where people felt dismissed, ignored, or undervalued. So the restoration of trust has to follow the same pattern. Slowly, intentionally, moment by moment. What does that look like in practice? It looks like catching someone doing something right, and genuinely acknowledging it, one-on-one, not in a group setting where it might feel performative. It looks like asking for someone's input on something before you need it, not just when you are desperate. It looks like being slightly more transparent about your own uncertainty, because when people see that you are human, their defenses come down. These are not soft skills. These are high-leverage interventions that transform team culture from the inside out. And the people who master these consistently report dramatic improvements in their working relationships within weeks, not months. We are talking about people who went from dreading Monday mornings to actually looking forward to going to work because they finally have tools that work. Now let me talk about the hardest part. There is always one situation that feels genuinely impossible. The person who seems entirely unwilling to change. The one who has been there the longest and carries their resentment like a badge of honor. The one who everyone walks on eggshells around. Maybe you are even thinking of someone specific right now. Here's what you need to understand about that person. They are often the person with the most unmet need for recognition and respect. I am not asking you to excuse their behavior. I am asking you to understand what drives it. Because understanding the driver gives you leverage that judgment never will. When you approach that person not as the difficult one but as someone who has been overlooked for long enough that they have started protecting themselves through aggression, something different becomes possible. You can acknowledge their experience without validating their behavior. And that distinction is everything. You might say something like, I know you have been carrying a lot of this team's weight for a long time and I do not think that has always been recognized the way it should be. I want to change that going forward. That is not weakness. That is precision. That is speaking directly to the wound instead of reacting to the symptom. What happens next is not always perfect, but it is almost always better than what happens when you ignore it or escalate it. And over time, you start to see the transformation that everyone said was impossible. Think about what that actually means for your life. Imagine walking into work next week and the tension that has been sitting in your chest is just a little bit lighter. Imagine a meeting where ideas actually flow, where people feel safe enough to disagree productively, where collaboration actually happens instead of just being a word on a mission statement poster. Imagine sleeping through the night because you are not carrying the weight of unresolved conflict into your dreams. That is not a fantasy. That is what happens when you apply these principles consistently over time. Professionals who transform their team dynamics report reduced anxiety, significantly improved job satisfaction, faster career advancement, and stronger professional relationships that follow them for years. The return on this investment of skill and attention is not just better meetings. It is a fundamentally different experience of your professional life. And here is the thing. Most people who need this most will watch this video, feel genuinely motivated, and then go back to the same patterns because motivation without a real system fades fast. It always does. The information alone is rarely enough. What changes outcomes is structure, accountability, and depth. If you feel that gap right now, if you can feel the difference between understanding something intellectually and actually being able to apply it under pressure, there is a program linked in the video description below that was built specifically for that gap. It gives you the depth and the framework to make this real in your actual workplace, not just in theory. The only people who should ignore that link are the ones who are completely satisfied with how things are going right now. You already know whether that is you or not.